Mark, welcome to the Mindshift podcast. How are we doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. We were just chatting before, and the sun is shining in Manchester, so over 2 days a year. I mean, yeah, nothing to complain about, I guess. Nothing to complain about.
Inhale it. I love the English thing where if the weather's okay, you basically just run outside in your underpants. So I'm assuming that's what you're going to do later.
Yep. And then I'm going to watch my neighbours watch me enjoy that, unless they're in my back garden as well, which, I mean, could be a thing. Could be a thing. Who
Well,
knows?
maybe they'll be in your underpants. That'll be cozy, neighborly.
So, Mark, I guess, I think we connected on Instagram originally, and then I think I started following you on LinkedIn. And then, yeah, I guess the podcast, and we'll get into all that. But I guess some of my listeners might not know who you are. So we're going to get into that really soon. But before we do, I ask my guests two questions right at the start. Question one: what is your log line? If you had to define you, who you are, and what you do, what would your log line be?
I'd say that I'm a writer who happens to teach strategy. I think that's pretty
Okay.
true.
Okay. Nice. Nice. And the last question before we get into it is pick a number between 1 and 12.
Do I tell you?
Yep.
Okay, 2.
2. Okay. Nice. So you just picked what we call a killer question. I'm going to ask you this question now. I don't want the answer, but we'll come back to it in a little bit. So the question what you've done is, the question what you've picked is, what's the one thing you're holding on to that you need to let go of? Okay.
Oh my gosh.
So we
As if
will
I
come
don't think
back to
about
that
that
one.
all the time.
So I guess, Matt, yeah, some of my listeners might not have come across you yet. They might not know who you are, what you do. So maybe, yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of the work you, I guess, first and foremost, and a little bit about your kind of career.
Aussie in New York, set up the first underground full-color hip-hop magazine with a CD-ROM for a little bit in the Southern Hemisphere, have worked in digital and advertising agencies since I was the age of 20, spent about a decade focusing more on user experience, information architecture, and content, and then around 28, joined Leo Burnett, became an account planner or a strategist, and have been trying to work out how to make sense of all of that stuff throughout. Have done radio, have written for a lot of magazines, raised $37,000 a few years ago for my first book, Strategy is Your Words. And now I teach strategy, I write about it, I talk about it all around the world. And I'm just trying to build a life around the things that kind of make me happy as much as possible.
Nice. So the hip hop magazine. Tell me a little bit about that. So I guess that was when I was doing my whole weird stalking and research on you. That was kind of like, oh, this is different. When I look at some of my guests, you have like a typical approach, but that kind of felt quite, yeah. How did that come about? What happened?
So I've been on the internet a very long time, and I just have this really bad affliction where if I see a thing that I enjoy and think I can do it okay, I'll start to do it. And that led me probably around the age of 18 or 19 to create a couple of very bad websites about hip hop. I was interviewing underground rappers, graffiti artists, turntablists or DJs, some breakdancers, etc. I just happened to live in the inner city of Sydney at the time, and I was a block away from the main hip hop radio show, which happened at 2SER at the top of UTS, University of Technology Sydney, which is right next to Chinatown in Sydney, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of it. And I just happened to kind of connect with a few groups from overseas who sent me some music and asked me if I could pass it on. And so I passed it on to this guy called Miguel D'Souza, who had been running that show for a very long time. And he asked me to kind of keep coming back. I was rapping at the time, not very well, but I would freestyle on that radio show, not very well at all. And then he kind of just got sick of it all and said, could you take it over? And I was 20. This was around 1998, 1999. And I did it for 5 years. All your favorite rappers and more came through that radio show. And I wrote for a lot of street press, underground hip hop and graffiti, zines, magazines from around the world, Ministry in the UK, all kinds. I was on BBC, or I was interviewed on the radio, I think, when Eminem came out with his movie, 8 Mile. And eventually, went from this website to this magazine to writing for street press to then launching a newsletter, a crappy 4 to 8 page photocopy kind of deal, newsletter for the radio show, and then magazine. The final kind of little, not twist, but the little thing that happened is right around 99, 2000, there was this big .com boom. And I'd only printed about 2 copies of this magazine, and it was not very good. It was very rough. I was designing it and writing most of it. And this big .com company approached me and said, could you become our editor? At the age of 20, I had no idea what I was doing, really. And then they gave us a bit of money to actually go full color. But then they went bust about 6 months later. And so I had enough money to buy paper for the next 2 to 3 issues. But, they kind of helped us go color.
So I guess there's something kind of full circle quite nice with the whole rap to the thing what you like to do now, which is like I enjoy writing and teaching. When you was doing the whole rap thing, what was like the thing what you really enjoyed about it? Was it performance? Was it the writing? What was the one thing?
The one thing would be the wordplay. So, freestyle rap became pretty big around that time, a lot of underground battles. And so that was always pretty fun. But I've always been more attracted to kind of literary rappers. So like an Aesop Rock, who's known as having, I think, the biggest vocabulary or for using the biggest vocabulary, someone like an LP from Run the Jewels, Atmosphere. There's a bunch of UK rappers that I used to be pretty close to. I was looking them up the other day, actually. But it was always about the wordplay. And I think within hip hop, you also can adopt a certain sense of masculinity, which can be healthy and not healthy. I didn't really know what it meant to be a man or how to be. Grew up with a single mum, not a lot of stability, and so I think I latched on to hip hop, having tried rave scene, a little bit of grunge, and hip hop just became my thing because it felt physical, competitive. There was a lot of wordplay. So that's what really kept me around it.
It's interesting you mentioned kind of the wordplay. So I'm currently just reading your book, which we'll dig into in a little bit. But the one thing what I kind of really enjoyed the book, and actually I'm really envious every time I turn a page over, I'm like, shit, why can't I write like that? Why can't I use really descriptive and just nice words? There's certain words in your book which instantly puts images in your mind. Like it's a really descriptive book. I haven't completed it yet, but like the first part of it is just really visually, stimulating, I guess.
It's quite weird. Yeah, it's absurdist. Yeah.
How did you even come up with it? So I mean, when I think about rap and I think about your book, for example, there must be a big. I say must be. It could be completely wrong, but you must need this big vocab. You must need this big range of vocabs and words. Or is that fair? Unfair? What?
I guess so. I mean, I've always been word oriented. Played Scrabble as a kid, Boggle. My brain literally, I'll be walking down the street and it's like, oh, there's a word. Oh, I like that word. That's a bad word. That's a weak word. Like that's just my brain. I married someone who's like that, but with numbers. And I just happen to be the opposite. I don't know if it has a name, the affliction, but it brings me. I love words. Like they're my love language. They're my love language since I was a kid. I've found myself in word. I used to write a lot of poetry, raps. I used to deal with a lot of sadness through journals. Always had pen pals, wrote a lot of postcards, Christmas cards. It was always through words. I'd write love letters on behalf of friends. So that's always been there, whether you need a big vocabulary or not, especially these days with the internet and rhyming dictionaries or online rhyming dictionaries. I don't know. But I think if you're going to write something, it definitely helps to enjoy words. Let's start there.
It's a good point. It's a good point. So you mentioned like childhood and stuff. So I have dyslexia and dyspraxia. So writing is a nightmare for me. I say that I've just finished writing my own book, but
Awesome.
it is a challenge. It's a challenge. But I want to take you right back to your childhood. Obviously, you're in school, and you always get asked that weird question: "What do you want to be when you grow up?" So when you was a child, what was the answer you'd give?
Oh dear. Well, I had this phase when I was probably 11 or 12 where I used to ask a lot of questions, but specifically like, could you sue someone for that? And I was lucky to go to a good school. That was one of the stable things in my life, and I was decent at exams. I was taught how to read and write at a very young age, and so I was sort of, yeah, just had this weird thing where my mum taught me how to read and write young. She learned a little bit about child psychology and teaching, and she was like a receptionist back when that's like was like a big thing to study and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it's always been there. My brain just skipped a beat. Oh my gosh, what just happened? Give me the question again.
Yeah. So, what did you want to be
Oh,
when
what do
you
you want to be
grow
when
up?
you grow up? Jesus, I'm trying to wade through traumatic stuff to give you a very simple answer to a light question. So, yeah, there was probably a phase where I thought I was going to be a lawyer.
Hmm. Okay.
And then people knew that I liked music, so it was suggested that maybe I could become a music lawyer. And then I got the grades to study law, so there I am with a shaved head and earrings, wearing my Nike shorts, going to law school at the age of 17, or doing a law degree and a business degree, and I hated it. I was like, this is so boring. I'd come home and make my rap websites. I'd put on music events. I put on parties at college. We got extorted by a gang. They all killed each other a little bit later. And so like I was just in this other world, but I had the grades to do serious stuff, which I didn't like.
You just skipped over a huge part then, where a
Yep,
gang went. Okay, sure. Let's needle into that a little bit, Mark. What?
sure.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so because I talk about some of this stuff in public, and I'm aware that I don't look like my stories. But a few years ago, I was like, I bet I could do some kind of I could write something or put on a show where I go through 100 weird stories that I don't look like, and one of them would probably involve us being extorted. So I think how old was I? 19. I was at University of New South Wales. A lot of our friends are Asian in Sydney. We have a big Asian population, and it was common to go to or host Asian dance parties. And so we put one on. We had like 500 people come out on a Wednesday night to this nightclub on Oxford Street in Sydney, and then we decided to do another one. But right around that time, there was a little bit of a splintering of a very well-known Vietnamese gang. You had the 5T, and then they splintered off into a gang called Madonna. And what they would do is come around to all of us putting on these parties and try to charge, I think it was like $500 Australian for security. Now, we were new, we were young, we were upstarts. There were people better connected to them. I'd be interested to see what they're all doing in life right now. I'm sure some of them have worked in banks and gone on to very big things, but they had some funny connections back then. And so they came to us through this DJ and were asking for money. We didn't end up paying them, but what happened is one of their guys had just gotten out of jail and he came to this nightclub. It was in Pitt Street. People had sort of heard some rumors, so our sales weren't as good as what we had hoped for. I think they're just trying to take us out or put pressure on us. And the security at this place, I think, were all Lebanese, which again is a big population. And in Sydney, and in the past 20 or so years, Lebanese have taken over a lot of the bikie gangs, like the Hells Angels, I believe. I'm aware that I'm a white guy and I'm saying Vietnamese and Lebanese. It's literally just how Sydney kind of falls into place. And growing up, I was between all different kinds of groups, rich, not rich, different backgrounds, and sort of, I don't know, helps me ride a little bit. But I was never stable. I was always between things and moving around. And so on this night, this little it was a short Vietnamese guy, and I say that because the main guy was actually quite big. He was like 6'3". It's not what you would think of stereotypically. Anyway, they get there and there's a little bit of a scuffle at the front door, and then a little bit later, the young guy comes back. Not the young guy, well, he probably was like 21 or something, just out of jail. He just starts to throw punches at these Lebanese bouncers who are huge. Within 10, 20 minutes, there's probably 50 cops. We only had like 100 people at the party, 150 people at the party, lost money. Probably 50 cops came down. The Lebanese guys are bringing their crew down, and I'm in the bathroom with them, like, who the hell are these people? And what's interesting is I bought this really good book last year written by an Australian Vietnamese lady, and it's about these gangs because I believe a lot of them ended up killing each other, the Vietnamese guys, because a lot of them were on meth and heroin and things went a little bit bad. It sort of builds around Cabramatta, the Cabramatta area in Sydney, and so yeah, it's kind of strange. And then also, what's interesting, I caught up with a friend recently, like a few days ago, who was we used to do radio shows back to back, and then in recent years, she was producing one of the main investigative news programs. And they've been doing all this stuff on these Lebanese gangs who 20 years on are now like running things into, sometimes I believe, into the Mexican cartels. So I'm not sharing this to say I was dangerous. I was always like, I was smart enough to not get caught up in stuff. I didn't go deep with things. I was around things, but not in things. Uh, and yeah, that's one of the stories. Yeah,
Whoa. And we'll take you even further back because I don't even know if this is going to top that one. When was the first time then that you can remember being in trouble? What happened?
in terms of what.
Just in general. Just like if I say when's the first time you can remember being in trouble? What's the first memory that pops to mind?
Well, I got pretty visceral memories from when I was a teenager. I mean, if you're talking about being in trouble as a kid, I was a pretty good kid. And then I remember one time when my parents were still together, I don't know what I did, but I was put outside and I smashed the window of a door. I was probably like 5, and I was chased around the backyard with a wooden spoon. So I remember that. Uh, but then, as a teenager, I had that was like the phase when people would get rolled. So someone would be like, you got a spare dollar? Got a spare dollar for Street Fighter, mate? Yeah, got a spare dollar for Street Fighter? Some guy tried to get me for $5. I used to play basketball down at Darling Harbour, which again is near Darling Harbour. Sorry, what did I say? Yeah, I used to play basketball at Darling Harbour, which is definitely near Darling Harbour, but it's near Chinatown as well. Because I grew up as a teenager, I was in Glebe and Drummoyne mostly, for the two people who know what I'm talking about. And yeah, I had 15, is again a Vietnamese gang, 15 guys surrounded me. I was 15 years old. They wanted my bandana, which cost $2. It was right around the time when White Men Can't Jump came out. And I'd done a few months of like Thai boxing, managed to get out. But if I think back to if I think about that kind of group now, I would have been stabbed. Like everything has just become so much more violent. I don't know how I got surrounded by 15 guys and got out. Like, because I didn't have to hit anyone or kick anyone. I just knew how to move a little bit from 6 months of Thai boxing. And so I was like, damn. So it's hard. Like I think back to some of the things I was around, and I've been threatened by cops as a teenager, all kinds of stuff.
Flipping heck.
It's
I
not a
mean, yeah, it's
competition.
no, no.
Not a
I just
competition. But the thing is, like, and I've been lucky. I've been being okay at exams got me through. But the thing is, all these stories are inside me all the time, and they hurt. So I carry a lot of pain, which is, I'm trying to work out my answer to the question from earlier. And I just think it'd be better without those kinds of interactions, because they just put you on edge. You constantly fight or flight, even as I get older. And
yeah.
I'm not a fighter. I got a black belt in martial arts, but I'm not a fighter.
I think it's an interesting one, right? Like the first rule usually of martial arts is to avoid getting into a scrap.
Yeah,
I didn't grow up in a rough area as such. Like Manchester, Salford. For people who don't know, it's got its rough parts, it's got its nice parts, as is always the case. Um, but yeah, you always got taught to kind of priority number one is learn how to fight, learn how to get out of scrappy situations. Like it's just, and I think when you have brothers, big brothers, it kind of gets embedded into you. But I guess one of the key things when I listen to your podcast and when I listen to and I look on your Insta and stuff, there's a lot of travel. It seems like in your life, one way or another. There's a lot of moving. How is and let's think about moving of life rather than travel for work. How has that created who you are today? That travel.
yeah, I love travel. So this year I've done Mexico City. Definitely been in a restaurant with like 100 narcos, 100 mafia guys there. That was super weird. Bulgaria. I've done Brazil. I'm about to go to Batumi, Georgia, Istanbul, Turkey, back to Bulgaria for a day. I'll do Peru this year, maybe back to Mexico City. So there's a lot of travel. I use it in my writing. I'm constantly listening to stories, hearing about people's frustrations and joys, and I'll turn them into social posts, or maybe even it's just something on a podcast. From the podcast, I'll often record myself walking around or sitting around in a location. And I paused on that for about a year, I realized, maybe 6 to 12 months, too long. But these locations become characters. So for maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I would record myself every week or two walking around Central Park. And Central Park became a character for people. And then there's just psychologically, it's hard. Like because I'm not used to stability, and that's not a criticism of anyone or anything, but I'm bouncy. Moving around helps me get out of my head a little bit, right? Because otherwise I can be quite ruminative, if that's even a word, but I ruminate a lot, and rumination can go into a spiral relatively quickly, depending on what I'm doing in life. But yeah, travel, it helps me kind of avoid some of those feelings. It focuses them. But then I'll also have those moments where I'm like, God, I miss my kids. I feel so lonely. But then I'm like, but I have to do this because often I'll teach and train, and it could be 50 people, it could be 500. That's when I feel most me. The rest of my life, I have to turn myself off, which I guess most people would feel, but I feel it in a very strong way. So traveling to me that's me. And, I'm going to keep doing it and try to do more of it. It's a beautiful thing.
You mentioned that it's most you. What is that? What is most you?
I just feel coherent in myself when I'm on stage. I can be funny. I don't get talked over. I have a deep voice, so in parts of my life, I get talked over a bit. I don't have to get bossed around. I don't have to get criticized. I'm protected from all of that on stage, and I can mess with people. I can use my sense of humor without someone going, "Oh, that's sarcastic," or "That's mean." It's just I'm a character, but that's the character that I'm most like. I feel like I'm most myself in that mode. And a lot of what I do is not necessarily talk so much. I'll do what education people would call constructivism, where I'll, generally speaking, know the themes I want to get into, but I'll construct it around the audience. An example of that, for example, is applying strategy frameworks to someone's psychology or a challenge that they've got in life. And so that someone will be up on stage with me, and I'll be talking to them about their midlife crisis, and the whole room is just like, "Whoa, I didn't expect this to happen." But we'll be using a strategy framework to teach strategy by kind of prying into someone's mind and the things that are holding them back in life. And I love it. It's therapeutic. It's full of words. It's full of, I can make jokes. I can just be free.
Nice. There's something, just listening to you talk about it, you can see the change in your face, the smile on your face, the thinking, the reflecting. It's really nice. So when we think about you traveling from who you are, young wee nipper, young kid, all the way up to today, like the travel where you've been. So I was in there. Currently, you're in New York, right?
Yeah.
What's that been like? Like bouncing across. Like what's been the I guess the biggest thing you didn't expect in that whole travel to happen to you?
I don't quite know, actually. I don't know how to answer that question. I think one thing that's been on my mind, just because there was Father's Day recently in Australia, and my dad also within a week of that turned 89, is the travel necessarily takes you away from people. I got teenagers. I love them. But it's not like we're hanging out all the time these days or having these deep conversations all the time these days. And so I'm like, I need to travel. I need to do this for me, because I don't always feel good if I'm not doing the things that bring me to life. And that is an understatement, what I just said. And so just from, what the surprises, or what have been the main surprises, it's really hard. I mean, for me, it's always about meeting cool people. I was in Brazil in a place called Santa Rita do Sapucaí, which is about 3 hours north of Sao Paulo recently. And some people kind of pulled me into their friend group. And then I found myself at dinner sitting next to the guy who directed the biggest Netflix movie in Brazil. He's about to do some stuff in the US. I don't know, he might become world famous. Opposite him is the guy who's made the most soundtracks in Brazil's history, including the soundtrack for City of God, the famous Brazilian movie. Next to them is a lady who's a movie producer. Her daughter's an upcoming an upcoming artist. I'm just like, damn, this is cool. This is literally why I travel. So there's that.
It's like, yeah, the unplanned magic moments about, like, I did crime scene investigation at uni. And when you talk about this, we talk about kind of when A hits B. So when car A hits car B, and there's this interchange. So a bit of car rubs onto B, and a bit of car B rubs onto A, and there's that friction. And when they both part ways, is that they've took a bit of each other with them. And I like thinking about that when I think about these random moments. Like, you find yourself, there's an exchange, and when they go away, you might not see them for 6 months, but you both took a piece of some of each other away. I guess is probably how I like to see it.
For sure, especially in Latin America. Latin America is very much like that. I think the UK is a little bit like that, but it's more reserved. I've done Ecuador, 3 cities of talks. I did 8 training sessions and talks in Brazil in 7 days a couple of weeks ago. And if you go to these places and you're doing something professional, but you actually listen to people, you talk to people, you engage with them, it often will surprise them, and then they'll invite you into their lives in really beautiful ways. Because especially in Latin America, they're used to more of a I'll take what I can get gringo. Somebody who goes there with a bit of a colonial mindset. They're there to make money, even though there's not a lot of not really a lot of money to be made. And if you don't behave like that, if you're sincere, if you're interested, it's just so cool. It's just so cool.
So there's like this great moment over here where you get brought into people's families, people's houses, but then you kind of quickly skipped over the narco moment, which I want to get into. You mentioned in Mexico. Was it Mexico you mentioned?
Yeah, yeah,
What?
yeah.
How did this happen?
It's been a bit of a theme this year. I've had a lot of strange situations, but yeah, I was out of Mexico City doing some training with a company owned by a billionaire, and the agency took us to a meal, and everyone was very big, and the ladies were very well dressed, and the waiters were all quite big. And I was like, what is this? And next to us was this table of a couple of guys who were wearing like fluoro green and pink. And I was like, oh, that's nice. They're on a date. That's cool. Mexico City's open minded and that. And I was like, hang on, there's something off about those guys. So I asked the client, like, what are those guys doing? And she's like, oh, they're narcos. That's the narco uniform, is to wear really flamboyant, fluoro pink and green and lime and yellow and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, they don't look it. And she's like, well, they could be like the accountants. And then I looked around. I was like, this whole place feels like it's full. They're either bankers or they're narcos, or that could be the same thing in Mexico City. And that's a stereotype, but it's kind of true. It's who has the money there. So some of these countries are run by, or proxy run by, people who have these kinds of careers. And it was just funny because at about 11 p.m., this Mediterranean, I'll call it Mediterranean music, it was non-specific, came on, and everybody except us stood up and grabbed, what do you put, arm locked in arm sort of thing, and then they start dancing in circles, and then this big treasure chest got brought out the size of a desk. People opened it, took out all these plates and started smashing plates. And I'm just like, what is this? What's happening? What's happening right now? Because there's no way I was going to do it, just in case I accidentally bump someone and all of a sudden I'm dead. But yeah, the people around me are like, yeah, this is. There's certain names for the ladies. Babushka, I think, is a word like that, babucha or something, which basically means like the girlfriend of dealer. So there was that.
How did you feel in that? Like, instantly go, oh, this feels like a dodgy place to be in. But did it feel like that? I mean, did it change when she knew who these people were?
A little, because you just don't want to like bump into someone in the wrong way. Although they're going to see you and know you're a gringo, and so they're probably not going to do anything. Like I wasn't terrified or anything. I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so memorable. I get to tell this story for the next few years. This is why I travel. Uh, yeah. And then when I was in Bulgaria a few months later, I was talking to them about, I just have these weird meetings with people because as I'm talking on stages these days, this has happened a few times this year. I'll talk on a stage and the people who bring me there, they're like, oh, there's a lunch now or there's a dinner now. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm like, okay, we're going for lunch. And then it's me and a guy who runs a bank. I'm like, where's everyone else? What happened? What happened? And a few of them have some funny stories as well, which, you know, my friends in Bulgaria is like, there's no such thing as mafia here. It's just part of the culture. So take that as a clue.
Oh man, and I think listening to your podcast and some of the stories that you share, there's definitely I think a book to be read around Mark's top 100 experiences. Like it's got to be done. It's got to be done.
Well, for me to do that, I'd have to take myself more seriously because I don't think anyone wants a book about me. Maybe I could sell like 100 on Instagram, but that's like a lot of effort to get it there. And then sometimes I forget the stories until I'm writing a proper book. So the book that you're reading, that has a lot of my trips in there. I remember tasting dulce de leche for the first time in Argentina. I pulled it into the book. There's lots of little moments from my trips that I will write about. The one that I'll probably start my next book with is this. It's about this. Well, I'll be talking about this fish from the Amazon called the kanjiru. It's this little fish, and the way it's explained to me for at least 30 minutes by the guy who's made the most soundtracks in Brazil's history because he found it really funny and he lives near the Amazon. He's like, there are these fish. Everyone's scared of the piranha. Everyone knows what the piranha is, but there's these other fish called the kangaroo. And what they do is they'll find any hole of yours, including your penis, and they'll go into it and they won't come out, and then they'll eat you from the inside. He's told me about this for 30 minutes, and I was like, I gotta work out how to use this. And so I'm pretty sure I'm going to use it to open up my next book.
I mean, that's a very much a good opener right there.
And it's
Wow.
begging for a metaphor, such as the one
Mm.
that I've been playing with is like good ideas are like kanjiru. You know, they
Mm.
okay, good ideas are like kanjiru. They get inside you. They won't leave until you do something about them, so on and so forth. They'll eat at you from the inside unless you do something with them. I don't know yet, but I got a starting point. And sometimes when you're writing it, you just need that sentence, which is just an unusual thing coming together, a common thing to make new meaning, and you're like, boom, I got the first chapter.
Mm. I mean, going back to that whole thing of the descriptive words in your current book now, paint that image into your book. Like back there, I'm just picturing that. Probably the wrong picture, but as a male, I'm like, that works. That works.
Yeah, yeah. I feel it as that, and then because kangaroo rhymes with kangaroo, I've got a second bit which I've been testing. I don't think these two work that well for me, but I think they're starting points, and I share them online a little bit. Some of these little thoughts to see if they stick at all. These didn't really, the kangaroo one, and then the second one because it rhymes with kangaroo is kangaroo, and that point is that advertising careers are like kangaroos; they go up and down and end in meth addictions. But I could turn that into a chapter as well. Have you not known a kangaroo with a meth addiction?
No,
That,
unfortunately not. I feel like I should have done. No.
yeah, thousands of them work in advertising.
Oh, I want to want an absolute image. I want to needle back. I want to go back a bit. You mentioned you did journals. And I guess when
Yeah,
I listen to you and stuff, like I find one of the best things what I like about your podcasts and just in general is there's an element of vulnerability in there. There's an element of sharing emotion. I guess the three things is like emotion, vulnerability, and rather than us talking about, hey, look how successful I am, you talk a lot around the things what failed or haven't worked. So like yeah, tell me about this whole area of vulnerability and sharing out loud, I guess, the vulnerabilities and the failures and stuff and the learnings. Like where does that come from? Is that just something you've had to train or is that just naturally come to you?
well, that stuff's in my head all the time. It's just whether it comes out and whether you're with people who want it to come out. And most of us are not with people who want that sort of stuff to come out. So we hold it in and we got to find a place for it or we get depressed. I'd say around 2008, 2009, I started blogging about strategy, about advertising, largely out of fear. because 2008, 2009, we had, that big global financial crisis, banks going under. I'd go to work every day with a couple of babies, not at work, they were at home, but I'd go to work every day, and you go to a client's office and, Microsoft, and it's like, whoa, this floor's empty. Last week it wasn't empty. What's going on? And so I thought, gosh, I think I got to write. I was more a hip hop guy in advertising, and then around 28, I was like, I think I got to take this stuff a little bit more seriously, build up a name. Probably wrote a few like corny cliche things. However, at that time, a lot of us would blog a few times a week in Australia. There was a good scene, and a few of us started to write about really vulnerable things, and we compiled some of it into this book called The Perfect Gift for a Man. And then I just started to experiment a little bit more with the vulnerable open stuff. But it was because I was around other people in the blogosphere, that's what we called it back then, who were okay with it, who encouraged it a little bit. And then I'd get little messages going, that was, it's good that you shared that. I appreciate it. I relate to that. I had a similar experience with this person in my life. And then I think it was about 12 years ago, just after I'd moved to New York, I got invited to do a TEDx talk. And so I did a TEDx talk. It wasn't filmed well. I don't think it was particularly good, but it was about how sort of the secrets that men hide in do a lot of damage to the world. And it's not to blame anyone, to point to point a finger at society altogether, but men and their secrets and their pain, it corrodes not just them, but families and societies. And so that was a point where I started to share more of my family's history. And I've just been chipping away at it. And the final thing I'll say about this is, I used to do these, what we call strategy supersizer mega class. It's a silly name, but with a friend called Julian Cole. And at the end of the day, I would do this session called Strategy Upon a Strategist, where I would tell some of my stories, and maybe in 20 minutes, we'd talk about a strategy framework and either apply it or talk about how to apply it to, your own criticism in your head. And I was nervous about doing this because my mate Julian, who's super well known, a great teacher, he was a bit younger than me, and I didn't want to be like trauma bombing him and trauma bombing the audience. And so I'd sometimes rush it. And then we'd, have drinks or food later, and people would come up crying, or they'd immediately share their own stories with each other because I'd cracked the seal. And this would have been 4 or 5 years ago. And from that, and then since then, since I saw the reaction, I got the messages. Now I just keep going. And I think that's what I'm becoming. I'm becoming the person who can talk about strategy, but is really talking about psychology and what it means to be alive. And I would say that even in teaching, my personal belief, I call it an insight. My insight is, I believe that one of the best ways to teach people strategy is to get them to study themselves. So there's a lot of 15 plus years of dabbling. And now I'm just trying to become all of that all the time.
So how does that kind of pan out or show up, I guess, in New York? New York, America, wherever, there's always this thing of putting on this, I won't say peacocking, but it's not the right thing, but there's something around how great you are and how successful you are. And I guess I see more of that and less of that kind of, no, hey, I've cocked up here a few times. This is me. I'm going to talk about how I'm feeling, the emotion side of me. How does that show up in where you are right now, i.e. the country you're in? Does it work? Or is it still kind of, there's a bit of a barrier, a tension around that?
No, it can. It just depends on the situations I'm in, because for me, New York is largely, I have a team now. I'm on Zooms a few days a week. I'm recording podcasts. I'm writing things. I'm trying to make courses. I'm doing events. A lot of my in-person stuff happens outside of New York. I might do maybe 10 things in person in New York. And it will depend on the environment that I go into, whether it's really corporate. If I'm teaching, I might hint at some personal stuff. Every now and then I'll go into it more fully. It really depends. And so the question for me is not so much, how does this affect what I do in New York? Because I do most stuff in New York. It's just that I'm not necessarily in rooms with people all the time in New York. But if I am doing something in Dallas or in Los Angeles, chances are someone's heard me talk about this stuff. And it's quite surreal because when you do things online, and especially if your voice is connected to them, I don't do a lot of video. I'd like to do more, but you go through these phases where if you spend a lot of time in someone's ears and you meet them in real life, first of all, they have to connect your mouth to your voice. And so I find that people, they watch your lips, especially because I have an Australian accent and I don't use my face a lot when I speak. Just how it is. They'll sort of zoom in on the lips, and then they'll sort of zoom out and they'll try to connect the lips and the voice to the whole body and the head and the hair, right? And then every now and then someone will want to talk to me about something that I said or someone else said on the podcast, and it's quite surreal um, when that happens. In Brazil, I had books with me, my books, and it's one of the few times since I published it 3 years ago that I've been near people as they've seen my book. And my book in Brazil, I took the Portuguese version, and so people are picking it up. Like, it's a nice art book. Um, we spend a bit of money to have like a nice cover and an emboss, and it's like metallic paint, and the edges are painted yellow. And so people pick it up and they're like, "Oh," and I know what they're thinking. They're like, "This is different from what I expected. It's a little bit more artsy, and there's like a spirit in it." And so I find those kinds of reactions in the real world quite interesting, because you're just a person who's getting on a plane going somewhere, and then you happen to be talking on a stage, and then you get off the stage and you go and eat, and then you go to your hotel, and maybe the next day you leave. So you're not really in your own energy the way that other people might be.
I think it's so true. I think there's something about experience design here. So I've done a lot of work around immersive experience design. Um, and I think when we think about experiences, they exist in kind of a macro, micro, and nano. And some of them is like the sense. So at a nano level, it's like the story, the sense, and the kind of space you're operating. Um, but the sense of your book, like you say, it's that tactical, that first experience. Oh, this feels different. I think you get a book. The book is a byproduct. I think the experience is the thing what we get first and foremost, which is really nice.
Well, it's
Nice.
really intentional with it, but also had some good advice from my designers and the company that published the book. So first of all, the or printed the book, not published. I published it, but the company that printed it, they publish a lot of art, a lot of books that are in art galleries and museums, and so they had good taste and more advanced things that I could choose from. But I was very intentional with it. I remember sitting down before I wrote it on a piece of paper, writing the things I believed in. Like, I wanted this book to feel like it was art, not a business book. And I don't mean that in a pretentious, obnoxious kind of way. But what that means to me is that I'm free to do what I want. If it's art, I'm free to do what I want. Another thing that I wanted it to do or to be is a book that felt like it was reading you, almost more than you were reading it. A lot of people don't get it. They won't get it. Like, people who haven't done this kind of work, who are not intuitive, who haven't had to deal with problems in their lives, who don't have bouncy brains, who are not emotionally oriented, they don't get it. Because I see who reviews my book, and I'm like, exactly, don't buy it. But people who have done this kind of work, who felt bouncy, who are sensitive people, they will say to me, and I've had this tens of times, and it's my favorite thing to hear, is like, that's the first time I've seen myself in a book. you know. But it was very intentional, and I appreciate that you appreciate the words. There are fake pages in there. I'm like, oh, far out. I should have rewritten that. And I've got these characters in the introduction. I didn't bring them through the whole book, and I didn't end with them. And it was because I was tired. I was just exhausted. So I'm like, dude, next time you got to do that better. But like, I can pick it apart a little bit, but also it's a piece of my soul that will live after I'm no longer living. And I'm really happy that I wrote it. And I sometimes will tear up just a little bit when I think about getting that book printed during the pandemic. I built all these classes around it. It fed my family for a couple of years, you know. And so the fact that some people really enjoy it, not everyone, but some people really enjoy it, and that it's helped me feed my family, it's again surreal, and it can make me just a little bit emotional.
So you're probably not going to like the next couple of questions. um, the the whole process of writing a book, like that
Yeah.
whole process. Um, when I was writing my book, I found it there was moments where the words just flowed, they just came really good, and then there's moments where I was like, "Sweet baby Jesus," I'm struggling to get like 5 words down on this paper. And I guess with your book, it's very focused on the person. It's a, like you say, it's a book what reads them as much as you read that book. How did you how did you go through that whole process, and how did you find writing the book?
So first of all, there's years of me testing material online, tweets, LinkedIn posts, teaching, right? And so I knew. So it's called Strategy is Your Words, and I still remember sitting down going, "What am I calling this thing?" And also, I read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way a little bit before. And then I was in Ireland visiting my sister, and I went to the Writers' Museum, and there's a few writers that I read as a teenager, and it was just amazing being in this very simple museum. It's really one room. And I was like, oh my gosh, James Joyce, W.B. Yeats, they were just so adamant that they had to write, to the point that James Joyce is like, screw you, Ireland, you don't even take me seriously enough. I'm going to France, or whatever he did, and why I could be misquoting history there entirely. But I was like, okay, so dude, take yourself seriously. You want to write this book? You know what half of it's going to be. It's basically going to be your masterclass, the stuff that you teach all the time, but you're going to write it properly. You're going to write it. I was a bit indulgent. It's a long book. And then the first half of the book, I was like, well, I want to write about words. So what are the words that people ask me about a lot? And that, again, one of the advantages of being a little bit active in public is you get a lot of questions. So where someone in the venture capital or VC world gets a lot of deal flow, writing, teaching, talking, you get a lot of question flow. And each question allows you to try to dig into your topic a little bit deeper, right? And then I took all my tweets and I was like, okay, which were the top tweets from the past decade? I've deleted nearly all of them. And I was like, okay, so I can use this content here, but I'm not going to be lazy like a lot of people who write blogs and compile books from their tweets where they just put that stuff into a book. No, that's different. You have to write it differently. And so I sat down coming back from Ireland, and then my brain is like, okay, what's the workflow for this? Because I don't want to get too overwhelmed. And I was like, dude, just open up. So I did it in Google Doc. The next book I'll do it as in Word, because Word's a little bit more advanced, but I did it in a Google Doc. And I was like, what am I writing about? Words and strategy. I have to use the word strategy. Otherwise people don't pay attention to me. And I'm like, but words are so obvious. And then I'm having this argument with myself. I'm like, well, if it's so obvious, why do you keep talking about it? I was like, okay, fine. Strategy is your words, but that's a silly title. That doesn't even seem to be grammatically correct. Don't worry. That's why it's funny. So I wrote that there. I put my name. I was like, okay, I got page one. And then I wrote a list of all the words that people had talked to me about: imposter syndrome, feeling like a lone wolf, confusion, clarity. And I was like, okay, they're going to be briefs each day. And then I started to write it. There was a lot of kind of procrastination and pent up energy, and I wanted to write fiction. I should be writing fiction if I'm really true to myself. But I was like, dude, you've got this book to get out of you before you die. And I would do the deathbed test a bit. Would I have been happy to have written this book before I died? Yeah. So I sat down and I wrote it in 4 or 5 months.
Wow. There's something really nice about your book, and I guess I'm not I've not, like I say, I've not completed it. But V is like a
Well,
very
you're reading the most difficult parts. So if you're okay with the most difficult parts, you'll be okay with the second half.
this is good, but I think there's a very clear thing, like you say. The first part is like the descriptive bits, the bits where I'm like, God damn it, envious. And then the second part of it is like the four points, right? There's a thing around the 4 points,
Yeah.
and I guess I wanted to kind of go through actually what strategy means first and foremost, and then we'll get into the 4 points. But yeah, what is strategy? Like, what is it?
Yeah. So the way that I define the word strategy, it's an informed opinion about how to win. So obviously you can be strategic in life. You can be strategic with your own internal criticism, with a relationship, with a partner, in football, in chess, business, military, whatever it is. But to me, it's an informed opinion typically about how to win. And in making that informed opinion, what I'm looking for is some kind of organizing idea expressed in a sentence or two, from which all the steps or tactics that you might take can flow, and through which you can organize your time, your money, people. But it basically becomes like this little operating system. And whenever I work on projects these days, I know other people talk about operating systems, but when I work on projects these days for myself, I create little operating systems for them. So the 1 or 2 pages I wrote about the book, who's it for, what problem am I trying to solve, what are the beliefs that I have, that became the operating system for me. So anytime I got lost, I could just read it and go, okay, good. You're going to write the first half in a very absurdist way. You're going to write some kind of crazy, weird, eccentric opening. You're going to make a point, give people a way to solve the problem that you've just brought up, and then maybe end with an absurdist way. But it became like an operating system. And so my brain skipped again. What is happening? Am I just getting old? I'm not even like in the. I'm not even in the White House. This is double brain skipping.
It's no, this is good. This is good. Like, so it's strategy. What is strategy? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So and then really what I'm talking about is account planning, which is strategy and advertising. But I think the Brits don't really like the word strategy that much because it's very American. But it was called account planning. It's been around for over 50 years. And typically the role of an account planner in an advertising agency is to conduct research, to talk to people, to try to understand what's happening in the world, what's happening with competitors, what makes a company or a brand of interest, and to distill all of that into some kind of strategy, a strategic presentation, a creative brief that would then go to a creative team, copywriter, art director, maybe other people, who'd come up with a campaign idea and then work out how to measure it all. So, there's two parts to that question. One is what strategy is in a secular way, and then there's like what strategy when it comes to advertising.
so I guess you pulled up on a good point though. Like, so I do a bit of strategy work, not loads, but what I find interesting with the work what I have done is they go, yeah, we need to do a strategy. And you go, okay, well, what does that mean to you? And then you kind of do the weird conga dance between finding out what that word actually means. And then you go, okay, cool. We need to go and speak to your people, maybe, or go and speak to these other people. And then they go, oh, we ain't got any resource for that. We just need you to go and work in silo over here in the corner. How do you tackle that with clients? Like in the past, how have you kind of danced that dance?
Well, I think when it comes to working for other people, when you sign them on, hopefully they sign up for the way you believe in working. That solves a lot of these problems. So if you want to do really creative work and you want to do strategy, then hopefully you've pitched them that and they've said, yes, we'll have that, please. So that's where it starts. It's very hard to come back from a lack of that to then having those things. Okay. But at the same time, if increasingly there's margins are going down, there's a shift from retainer-based work to project-based work, time pressure, smaller budgets, more deliverables, there's still always an opportunity to get an hour, half a day to do a little bit of research. You could look at academic research through Google Scholar. You could look at keyword research. You can go through consumer reviews. You can go through Reddit and Quora. And while some of those behaviors might get put in this category of being a Google strategist or a Google planner, as in someone who never leaves their desk, never ventures into the real world and just Googles things, you can still arrive at interesting thoughts and interesting strategies from your laptop and from trying to get a proxy, and it's not even necessarily a proxy, but trying to get a gauge for what's happening in the world, how people perceive a particular brand or product, why they buy it, why they don't buy it. You can do that from your desk, but it's always nice to talk to people.
We will come to the 4 points, but there's something which you just dropped needle. You kind of just mentioned there, and it's like the word thoughts. I was watching a webinar, and you have a very clear distinction between kind of thoughts and ideas. Perhaps share that with my listeners. I love how you explain it, and I love the linking like with Edward de Bono and stuff. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's all large. Well, it's largely paraphrasing Edward de Bono, who passed away recently. He published a book called The Uses of Lateral Thinking in 1967. He's written tens and tens, probably 100 plus books that a lot of people in business have used. They were very famous. He was very famous. What blows me away is there's people like him, Marshall McLuhan, and they were kind of like international intellectual celebrities in the 1960s and 1970s. And then I don't know what happened. Maybe the 1980s just went a little bit capitalistic, materialistic, and intellectual heroes tend not to be international celebrities as much these days, I think, unless they sort of break through on a couple of podcasts, the big podcasts. But it starts with this, that ideas are a kind of thought, but not all thoughts are ideas. Now, what's the point of that statement? Well, the point of that statement is if you brainstorm, if you workshop, if you come up with ideas for a living, and often with other people, you need to know what an idea is, or the way you will work together will be very, very messy. So if you're in a workshop and people are like, let's come up with some ideas about how to launch this new coffee. And you're like, I've got an idea. We should do a partnership with Uber. I've got an idea. We should do something at South by Southwest. I've got an idea. We should send the coffee into space. None of those are really ideas. They're just thoughts. An idea is at least two topics coming together, where you give it a name. But when the two topics come together, topic A and topic B, they create new meaning. New meaning creates new value. And so what those thoughts need is more of a container. So if you're going to do something with Uber, you're going to do something South by Southwest, and you're going to send the coffee into space. Well, let's say you put those three things together. What's it called? And then what is it in a sentence? I've not used this one before, so I don't know what's going to come out. But do you have an answer? What's an idea where you put those three things together?
I mean, I was ready to ask you that one, Mark.
Well, let's do it. Let's do it. I don't mind. I'm not going to say it's going to be any good. Okay, so let's say you find again, I don't know what the brand is, but you find the most driven Uber car in the world. You do some kind of deal with Musk. You turn it into a rocket, and you put the most caffeinated person in the world into this rocket. You call it highly caffeinated. I don't know what's happening right now, but this person is definitely getting like flown into space.
Mm-hmm.
And we just see if they have enough caffeine to get home. Maybe it's like a caffeine fueled car. I don't know, but the way that you arrive at ideas is by thinking in kind of weird ways, the way I was without editing, and then you just need to give it a name. So this is a weak name. We'll just call it, I don't know, highly caffeinated. What's the idea? The idea is an Uber car converted into a rocket fueled by caffeine. It's not even possible. Let's pretend fueled by caffeine with the Uber driver who's the most caffeinated. They go into space. Blah 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 blah. I don't even know what the idea is yet, but you see how that's more of an idea because there's a thing, and it's not just random thoughts.
Yeah, it's going really expansive, ultimately, first and foremost, right? So then later maybe you distill down, but don't. There's something about not killing the idea before it becomes an idea, before it becomes a thing. And I do see that quite a lot. There's that kind of reduction mindset before anything ever really comes about. It's like, I think as children, we're really good at coming up with this. We're really good at thinking really lateral and really expansive. But as adults, over time, we get that kind of. It's like we forget who we were. As over time, we get told, no, you've got to be more logical, and you've got to be more. That won't work here, and we put all these filters on top of this idea, and then before you know it, you got this weak idea, this weak thought, and even at that point, you don't feel in a safe space to even share it in a lot of places.
Yeah, well, the academics, the people who study the psychology of creativity or just creativity, they would refer to, I guess, what I was just doing as trying to come up with a deep thought or depth of thought. And comedians are really good at this, but it's often just like a long run-on sentence or paragraph where you're like, okay, we're in Manchester, everyone's wearing red, a car comes along. Who's in the car? It's aliens. They're in the car. They're drinking coffee. It's an Uber driver. And you just kind of keep adding these attributes. And eventually you start to make sense of it. But that's a like depth of thought. Whereas in workshops, typically when you're running them, people will often give you like one word answers, and it'll often be jargon. So let's say you're talking about like, hey, what are some of the strengths of this company or this brand? And people are like provenance, origins, heritage. And you're like, well, that's not useful. It's cliche. These are dull words. What do you mean by that? And you start to push in a little bit heritage. And someone's like, oh, well, in 1812, this weird thing happened. And then this dog did this. And you're like, oh, that's awesome. Great. That starts to become useful. But it's once you get through the one word gates that people use to signal that they're intelligent, educated, high status, but that they also use to kind of block the truth. Once you get through them, that's when the real sort of meaty stuff happens.
I think there's a real art to really challenging that and pushing through that. And there's something what I've noticed what in the first part of your book you talk about truths, the different types of truths. So you've got like I think you talk about disobedient, obedient, taboo, and then there's like banal truths as well. Maybe share a little bit about them. I when I looked at my Kindle highlights, they are like straight away I was like, yep, I'm highlighting these for sure. So maybe tell people about them.
Banal truths in particular.
Yeah, let's go with them. Let's go with them.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think when we're talking about being creative, and we're using the word truth, the truths that we're talking about with creativity are typically going to be awkward, uncomfortable, dangerous. They might put us at risk. So when I'm like casually saying, I was in a room with 100 narcos, that's maybe a bit of a risky thing to say. It's not a truth. It's something that happened. It's a fact. Or, yeah, we were once extorted by this gang and then they all killed each other. It's like, ooh, gosh, right? But that's kind of the energy that you can connect to, even when you're working for clients. It's and a lot of people pick fights with the word insight and truth these days. And I think what I tend to go for when I'm interviewing a lot of people on a project is for confessions. I want to have a conversation with them where they feel listened to, where they feel respected, and eventually they say something. And you're like, oh, I think that could be the first time you've said that. And I don't think a lot of other people, well, I don't think a lot of people have heard you say that if you've even said it to other people. And that's where you've got something interesting. An example that I use very often is I was interviewing guys about losing hair, and the guy said to me, I don't feel accomplished enough to be bald. Okay, so on the one hand, that's an idea, sort of, because you've got two topics there: accomplishment and going bald. So that sentence has the mechanics of an idea, sort of, but that's a confessional truth. Banal truths are probably what we see in 95 to 99% of business documents, and when it comes to brand strategy or advertising strategy, it's stuff like mums are busy, millennials like experiences, not things. People are tired from the pandemic. It's just like, so what? Boring. Tell me something I haven't heard before.
Do we value that more though? And I guess the way what I'm thinking is this is there's lots of time. So I work predominantly in cultures, right? So helping create better people experiences in companies for their employees. That tends to be the place. So my kind of products tend to be, oh, how do we create a great onboarding? How do we create a great reward system? How do we say goodbye really well to these people and everything in between? And it's interesting. I'm redesigning a joiner experience right now for new employees, how we bring people into the business. And there's always the mundane, the things where yeah, people expect a laptop on day one. Like, of course you do. You for remote working. But then there's the other bits where you're like, holy shit though, what about this thing? This is the thing that's gonna win you awards. This is the thing that's gonna really make you stand out in how you approach your joint experience. And then when these are played back in a form of a culture mirror or whatever else, people are like, yeah, but these things over here, these feel really tactical, we can do these. I'm like, yeah, but you're not driving anything, you're not pushing forward, what is your measurement of like great at this point? The basics or the extraordinary? And I think how do you navigate that? Because ideally, I find it more exciting working this bucket. Whoa, let's win awards for this.
Yeah, well, you'd hope that there's some self-selection there, so that if you talk about this stuff online, if your website talks in the way that you were just talking, that someone's like, yes, I'll have that. But having said that, I get brought into things, and people are pretty familiar when they bring me in with the stuff that I'll write online, and they can be very resistant. But I know that they've read my stuff because they might have said they've read my stuff. And I'll be like, I'll just bring up a post and be like, come on now. Remember we talked about this? But also, I think it just goes back to, what is this industry, broadly speaking, whether it's advertising, marketing, communications, experience. And like the bulk of the industry or the category is really for just good enough work. And there's a huge market for mediocre work. But just good enough work is probably, between mediocre work and just good enough work, let's pretend that it's slightly different. There's probably 80% of the demand out there. Because if it's not, they go to the best people, the best agencies, and they just say, do what you know how to do. But that's, 10 to 20% as a truism.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame. But I like the point which you mentioned there, like, oh, hold on, let's just bring this post up. You know who I am. You know what I do. You've got me in for a
I don't.
reason.
I don't lean in. I don't lean into that, but I'll. Yeah. Sometimes I have to remind people that because most strategists aren't that on the internet, right? And I am, which doesn't make me better or worse, but it does mean that I can point at things that I've done and go, I understand why you're feeling this way. Here's when I felt that way. Here's what I did. Here's how it worked. It might not replicate for you, but we're talking about the same principles. And then the person has to sort of pause and go, well, why did I bring him in if I don't want to follow this a little bit?
Yeah. Tell people
But
about
what
the
you're
4
talking,
points.
but just, well, I will in a second. But I think what you're talking about this there's a lot of frustration out there with the dynamics that you're talking about seeing the world in a full full color way, right? And then having to feel that your documents have to be a bit grey to get through bureaucracy. And I think over time, people are just going to leave the industry because they're going to be like, hang on, there's like more interesting stuff that we could do. There are deeper truths that we could do. And yeah, I'm earning money, but like, I'm frustrated. So I think there's this tension out there that taps into what you sort of described. That I don't know. I think a lot of people will try to find a truer way to bring their sense of the world to life in the coming years.
It's a good point, and it kind of gets me thinking about roles and jobs in general. So if I was to think about the melting pot of me, so immersive experience design, done stuff with Punch Drunk, design thinking, service design, innovation, done all this good stuff, and then I apply that into a very tiny sector of let me help keep people's cultures be better, one way or another, in a collection of products, services, and experiences. But actually, when you go for a job and they go, "What are you?" and you go, "Oh, I'm this person, this skill set, like an ultimate remixer, if you like," and they go, "Yeah, but you don't fit our box. You don't fit this little square peg. What we need you to fit in." And it's a shame. In one respect, I go, I understand why you need a square peg. I understand why you need for people to fit in that box. But how many people have you just missed by trying to force someone into that?
Yeah. This is the US mindset. It's how you make a factory happen, and then the people who make these decisions, it replicates because they fill companies with people who can only exist in a box, and then they hire people who can exist in a box. Those people are easier to replace because they just do stuff that's in a box, and then the whole thing just becomes really robotic. That's not how you have effective creative departments or strategy teams. So to have effective creative departments and strategy teams, you need people from different backgrounds, but you need people who manage them who can connect dots for them, or who can protect them from bureaucracy a little bit, or even explain some of the idiosyncrasies. But yeah, it's I mean, the more that we're in boxes, the easier we're going to be to replace by artificial intelligence and machines and robots.
Yeah. So there you go, people. Get out your box as fast as possible. Tell me about the 4 points. Tell my friend, but only tell me enough where to go out and buy the book, right? Don't give them too much.
Nah,
Like,
But there's different strategy frameworks out there, and there's one that I created it, but it sounds weird to say that. It's called the 4 points, and what it helps people do is navigate problems. It could be something to do with a brand, something to do with advertising, could be something to do with internal criticism. The 4 points are these: problem, insight, advantage, strategy. So you imagine problem at the top, strategy at the bottom, and then east and west. East would be advantage, west is insight. And helps you work out how to apply critical thinking, creativity techniques, or creative techniques to the world.
okay. I mean, that was very concise to be fair. To be fair. Um, so how did that come about? Like, how did you go from? How do you come up with that? Like, how do you come up with that? And actually, there's probably a follow up question. Like, how do you make it so succinct? I guess there's something around. Often frameworks are used to. There's a whole thing around bullshit baffles brains, and actually, there's something around being so clear and succinct with what this does. That you go, this is a no brainer.
Yeah, so one of the main frameworks that people use in account planning is the four C's, although there can be 5 or 6 C's. And the four C's, if you think about a 2 by 2 quadrant, consumer truth, cultural truth, competitor or category truth, and then company truth. And so you typically conduct a whole bunch of research, workshops, etc., and then fill each of those boxes, usually with a sentence. And then in the middle, there could be a brand essence or a strategy statement or something that's like the organizing idea from a strategic point of view. When I was at Leo Burnett in Sydney, when I was about 28 years old, we focused a lot on problem solving. So my boss, Todd Sampson, who gave me my first full-time, I was doing 50% digital work, 50% account planning work. So that meant doing information architecture for like Rabobank and Ubay Kotex and Kimberly Clark brands on the one hand, and then doing creative briefs for Amstel, Heineken, Canon on the other hand. But he and his partners brought in to Leo Burnett this focus for us called collaborative problem solving, CPS. So a lot of Edward de Bono, trying to think differently, not just make ads, not just lead with a TV script. And then I moved to the US and was working in a digital agency that didn't like process. It was very maverick, really cool work. It's called Big Spaceship. And so I said to them, okay, look, if you don't want process, if you don't want necessarily even a creative brief template, please at least get these 4 sentences together on a brief: problem, insight, advantage, strategy. Because I believe that they're going to be good forcing functions for better questions and research, actually trying to work out what problem we're trying to solve. That'll lead to better relationships with clients. We'll work better. Our presentations will be smoother. The 4 points as 4 sentences are really like 4 sentences that you can build the first 20 slides of a presentation around as well. Now, the 4 C's, what I found is when I started to focus more on the problem we needed to solve, being the obstacle or the barrier that's preventing someone from doing something or buying something, that you started to add the problem to the 4 C's and then a few other things here and there. And it just became this really big Frankenstein framework. I didn't really like it. So I still think through those 4 C's, although there's 5 and 6. 5 is conscious inclusion. McCann used this, which is like, is there a group of people we should include in our communication? And a 6C could be channel or context, contextual truth, as in like what's happening in the media. And I think through all of those on any project, but I just like how the 4 points focuses on the problem because, as many people have said well before me, often in a well-stated problem, you can find a solution.
There's something quite nice about it. There's something around clear beats complicated or clever every time, and I think the clearness of it. And again, I'm I'm only so far into the 4 points, so I can't comment too much on it because I've still got lots to read. But yeah, the clearness of it and the way it's written in a simple way makes me kind of understand and go, oh, okay, it starts allowing me to piece things together, which often are sometimes blind spots, being completely honest to me. So I've got 2 more, maybe 3 more questions to take us home. So one of them is around the podcast, and the other one is around your training. So let's go to training first. So you have this training, but I think I heard in your podcast, you used to do it in comedy stores, or you still do, or is that where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, I talk a lot about stand-up comedy, and so I like to, if I'm working with companies, I'm like, is there a stand-up comedy club near you that we could do this in? When I've done my own private events, I have a couple of places that I'll hire and I'll look at a comedy club. Not all of them are set up very well, and sometimes they're not that clean and they smell a little bit. So I don't always do it in the comedy club. But there's a little bit of research about the power of offsites. And I've been an offsite cynic for a very long time. I was often a young person in a management team. And I was like, why do we do these offsites? It feels like a waste of time. And all we get are these management initiatives that nobody really does or wants to do. And we have to pretend that we do. But there is a little bit of research about how offsites provide, a peak experience. And as someone who works with experiences, you know what that is. And that peak experience, the leftovers of it can last for a few days, maybe a few weeks, probably not months. So that's really where the comedy comes from. And I try to connect people to if you're going to write an insight, for example, or a truth or whatever you want to call it, spend some time around stand-up comedy. Short words, concise language. Each sentence has got to land or it gets deleted. There's a real discipline to a lot of stand-up comedy that it's very easy to take for granted until you listen to how long people might spend developing a 5-minute set and then a 30-minute set and then, a 90-minute set maybe or 60-minute set. So that's where the stand-up comedy comes in, or the stand-up comedy club come in.
It's fascinating. Going back to the experience, right? The kind of nano space sense story, like the space in which you've created this training. I remember listening to it and going, "Holy shit, that's such a good idea!" Like, this is just such a good idea. But obviously, with the added context now, I'm like, it then links to the tightness of the writing and how this comes together. Um, I messaged you a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to your podcast while you was doing your walking wonders or your noodles or whatever. They're what I call them, but they're just your walking podcasts. Um, and I love him. I love him. I feel, I'm not from New York. I'm not in New York, but when you do them podcasts, it feels like I'm on a walk with them. It's just having a chat. How do you find them? How do you find, like, what's the difference between doing them for you versus doing them in like a studio? Like, yeah.
Well, I don't really have a studio or much personal space right now, so I'm a little restricted, and it really frustrates me because I'm quite impulsive, I'm quite spontaneous, and if I want to communicate or I want to do a thing, to then think about, okay, where do I set up? Oh, I've got to pull everything out, I've got to turn the lights on, and then I've got to pack it away because we've got no space in the apartment before people come home. Like, that creates, I know that's first world issues, but it gets to me. It gets to me more and more as I get older. And so a lot of what I've done over the past at least 5 years is think, okay, you want to communicate, you want to do some stuff in public. How do you do it in a way where there's not much friction? So the first 100 or so episodes of the podcast, I didn't even edit. They're really rough and raw. I should have taken them more seriously. I should have had music. I didn't even do music until, probably 200 episodes in or whatever. And barely now do I do music. And then about 4 years ago or so, I came back from India, I'd done some talks there, and I used to do a lot of walks around Central Park. It's sort of like just therapy for me, and found walking actually quite productive. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to get some questions from Instagram. I'm going to answer them on this walk. I did it. I was like, this is so obnoxious. But to your point earlier about Times Square in New York, people don't really care here. They don't really care. And even since then, there are so many like creators and quote unquote influencers around filming things and recording things that, people don't care. They don't interrupt you. And if they do, it might be to say, oh, hey, what are you doing? And so it felt really obnoxious. And then I posted a few of them. And it's funny because like the past month or so, I'm mostly recording monologues just by myself sitting down, or I was in Sao Paulo. I got some new equipment. It clicks for me. It sucks. I'm like, dude, just sort out your equipment. Why can't you fix your equipment? Sort of drives me a little bit insane. And then I remember traveling a little bit, and people would come up to me and go, "Hey, I just like listening to you talking." Now, I know well enough that that's not about me. I'm just a character, and I have a deep voice, and you get to hear the city wherever I am, uh, and you play a role in people's lives. But also, I do spend a little bit of time on the YouTubes, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this whole genre of people who do this, and they've been filming them. And so I start to criticize myself. Like, dude, why didn't you take yourself more seriously when you were younger? You could have been filming this stuff for a decade now. So, that that's the full circle of me enjoying that weird format and then me judging myself for not being more professional.
I love him. I love him. And you challenged me on the DMs to say, why don't you give it a go? And I think I'm going to accept that challenge and definitely give it a go. Just
It,
to go on, sorry.
I was going to say, because you know what happens physiologically? It turns on the parasympathetic nervous system, which turns off the fight or flight response. And so your brain starts to sew things together. And we know this intuitively if we don't have those fancy words for what happens. And the words come, and it just helps you think about things differently. Your brain's doing something else. You're in nature, which is obviously good for mental health if you're outside doing the walk rather than sitting inside, I don't know, walking on the spot or sitting at a desk. But you start to experience yourself in a different way too, as someone who makes things. And it is quite beautiful. But also, you're just a character in people's heads. to the point where I've had a couple of people say, "Can you stop interviewing people?" And I was like, "What? That's a weird thing." I've interviewed a lot of people in my life because I did hip hop radio and then this podcast. It was always about getting other people's voices out there. And then I started to think about a few of the people that I spent a bit of time watching on YouTube, and I was like, "Oh, I think it's because you think I'm cheating on you with this person." Like, there's like that parasocial dynamic that grows, or they're sort of, as I get older as well, latching onto me as like a boss, like a boss by proxy that they don't have in their real lives. I'm like, oh, okay, that might be what's going on for a few people. And podcasts are very hard to grow, as you know. And so it's like, well, what's the role of this podcast? I do want to do video, but then video is a full-time job for everyone, like for a lot of people. So yeah, it's hard, but I feel driven to do bigger things. The podcast is it's very intimate, being in someone's ears like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I do find myself with the walking ones, I find myself actually, I won't say active listening, but that's not the right way, but there's something around, I'm paying more attention. Like there's the ambient noise in the background of the alarm, the sirens and people chatting as they're walking past. And there's something around, it feels more human. The podcast actually feels more human because of it. Often we spend time in these rooms where it's like, yeah, soundproofing and it's all this stuff, but it removes a couple of layers of senses on that journey, I find.
Mm.
I lied. I had two more questions. We asked you a question. We asked you to pick a number right at the very start, and I want to come back round to that. So, can you remember the question?
This is what's something that I'd like to leave behind.
It was, what
Move
you
on from?
holding on to right now, what you need to let go of.
It's a tough one because it's something that I've not been able to solve through writing, through therapy, through anything. But yeah, I have like a big knot of melancholy built into me. And it flares up on like long weekends, if I take time off, if there's like a special event. So that would be my answer.
Okay, nice. Right at the start, I asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up. And as you know, Mark, we continue to grow up and we never actually stop. So if I was to ask you this question now, today, Mark, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would your answer be?
Well, to use some big words, I'm trying to self-actualize. I'm trying to become more of who I think I am. And that person writes, they teach, they talk, they listen, they explore the world, they try to leave the people they interact with in a slightly better place than they were before. Not always, but try to. And the labels I would put on there is it's someone who's definitely bringing together creative life, psychology, critical thinking techniques, and just the exploration of what it means to be a human. And all those things together, I think, are a little not plain, but there's nothing like, oh my gosh. But I feel like I'm touching on something that's not very common. And I think it happens because I'm often dealing with people who are quite intelligent, quite sensitive, have a lot of feelings, and who don't always necessarily see themselves represented in the world. And deep down, I feel that if those people had a bit more power, I'm using the word power, small p, not necessarily political power, but just more capacity and or bandwidth to put themselves into the world rather than putting themselves into a creative brief or a strategic presentation or timesheets. I just think the world could benefit a lot from the people I get around. And so that's what I'm going to keep doing. But I want to take bigger creative risks.
Nice. Thank you, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure. Where can my listeners follow you? Where can they buy the book? Where can we get the training? Tell me everything. Where can we find you?
Well, you can find me on most platforms as Mark Pollard, at Mark Pollard if you need to. And then you can find training and our books at sweathead.com. I do have the book up on Kindle in some countries, in some languages, not everywhere, because I don't know. I want people to be touching it and smelling it. It's different. That's a different kind of experience. But at Mark Pollard or sweathead.com.
Awesome. Mark, take it easy, and I'll speak to you soon.
Peace.